Hello, I'm Laurel Collins, a Member of Parliament for Victoria. I'm here with Jagmeet Singh. We just had a community meet and greet at Bear and Joey, one of the businesses we've been fighting for. Really honored to introduce Jagmeet Singh.
Thanks so much. And I just wanted to say we have been doing a tour of the island, meeting with people, hearing their concerns. One of the biggest concerns we're hearing is housing. We want to make sure that people have a place to call home. The other concern is that there are a lot of sectors that are hard hit on the island. We know tourism is hard hit, the service sector has been hard hit, and there are a lot of businesses that opened up during the pandemic that didn't qualify for support. So Bear and Joey is one of those examples. We're here to fight for small business owners, for people, and we're really looking forward to meeting with more folks for the rest of my tour, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So thank you so much for being here, and I'm ready to take any questions you might have.
Would you like the Prime Minister to just get it out of the way and tell Canadians we're going to an election at some point in the next few months?
Well, there's certainly a lot of uncertainty because the Prime Minister has made it look like he's going to an election. I've asked the question a number of times, would he commit to not holding an election while we are fighting this pandemic? And he has not answered, suggesting to me that he's looking for an excuse. I also want to highlight, this is not a foregone conclusion. We've got 2 years left on our mandate. We can continue to work to get help to people. I believe it's irresponsible at this point when we are just seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. People are getting vaccinated, things are opening up. It would be risky to put all those sacrifices to risk by having a national election that could cause additional problems. We've seen other provinces struggle recently. Newfoundland and Labrador had an election where they had to push back the date of the election a number of times, which really put democracy at risk. So I believe what we need to do right now is focus on getting help to people. And if Justin Trudeau wants to do that and all of his announcements aren't just for show, then he can continue to work with me to deliver the help that Canadians need. We can go back to Ottawa in September and do that.
You spent the last 2 days with Premier John Horgan. He endorsed you in the last election. You two have spent a lot of time together. Are you worried that the Prime Minister is capitalizing on Horgan's success here to boost his own profile in British Columbia, and that he may be seen as a symbol that Horgan will indeed support Liberals rather than you in whenever this next federal election is?
I'm not worried at all. I'm in fact not surprised that Justin Trudeau, a Liberal Prime Minister who's been promising childcare for decades, wanted to make the announcement with a New Democrat Premier who's actually done the work. New Democrats have done the work to deliver. John Horgan, as soon as he became Premier, immediately started working to deliver a childcare pilot project, which has changed the lives of so many people. He's shown his commitment, he's shown that he's willing to do the work, and that's what New Democrats do. So I'm not surprised, and I think it's an important announcement. I think it's so important, and I want to acknowledge all the advocates, the childcare advocates, the activists who've pushed so hard, New Democrats who pushed so hard to get us to this point. But I also want to challenge Justin Trudeau. If he really wants to deliver on universal childcare, then let's go back to Ottawa in September and do that work. Or was this all for show? Is it just to make a flashy announcement before an election? That would just undermine any credibility that Justin Trudeau has if he's just doing this for show. So again, I call on him, let's get this done. I'm happy to support any legislation, any steps needed to deliver that care. And I know that New Democrats deliver, that's what we do. And I want to make sure that Justin Trudeau is actually held to account and doesn't just get away with making the announcement without delivering the help that people need.
Yeah, can you speak to the federal government's response to the fires in BC? They're touring Lytton today, the residents are touring Lytton today to see the damage. What's your opinion about federal government's assistance towards them?
Certainly, I just want to start off by saying how devastating the heat waves have been. We know that so many people were not equipped to deal with temperatures like that. In BC, we're not used to those type of temperatures. Buildings and homes aren't equipped for that. And we saw that vulnerable seniors bore the brunt of that heat wave, and hundreds of people lost their lives in sudden deaths. It was devastating to see that. And on top of that, Lytton is another example of the immediate and urgent impact of the climate crisis. Those climate fires meant an entire community was devastated. People lost their homes, and we know that we need to act. At the federal level, Justin Trudeau's talked a lot about the climate and how important the climate crisis is, but he hasn't delivered any real concrete steps to fight the climate crisis with the urgency that it needs. If we look at his decisions, he's put a price on pollution, but exempted the biggest polluters. That doesn't actually help us fight the climate crisis. In addition, with Justin Trudeau 6 years as Prime Minister, it is the worst track record of all G7 nations, with the only nation that's actually increased emissions over the time that he has been in power. So he's done a horrible job. We need to tackle this climate crisis with urgency. We are committed to doing that. We want to see jobs created, and we want to see opportunities to reduce emissions. There is an opportunity here to do what's right, and we've got to do that by creating good jobs that lower our emissions, retrofitting homes, investing in renewable energy, clean energy. We can do a lot, and we've got to take it seriously. The impact isn't in the future, it's impacting us right now.
Do you think the federal government should launch a large investigation into trains running during hot temperatures? We don't know yet whether a train was involved here, but it is part of an investigation. We've seen other places in the world where trains have been involved in starting fire. Should the federal government be looking at this issue around when we have heat waves or wildfire season, stopping train transport?
Well, there's a couple things. One, we've seen with the Conservatives that a lot of the safety mechanisms and protocols that were in place to keep people safe around rail travel were cut, and then we saw the horrible disaster at Lac Mégantic. And we know that there needs to always be a very vigilant and robust safety protocol and checks and balances in place to make sure that rail travel is safe. That's very important. We also know that we need to be proactive. With the climate crisis, we know that communities need to be prepared for disasters. And instead of responding to a crisis after it happens, we've been working with FCM, and their ask has been to put in place proactive steps to make sure communities are ready for disasters, that they are taking steps in advance to prepare their communities. That's something that we need to do. The climate crisis is a reality. We need to prevent the increase of emissions, the increase in temperature, but we also need to take steps now to protect people and communities from the real risk that the climate crisis poses.
This morning, local First Nations leaders met with local mayors and people in the province, and they want to lower the tone, lower the rhetoric, racism, basically. What do you think could be done? How do we lower the tone and get everybody to calm down and stop with the burning up the churches, burning up totem poles up in Malak?
I think the Indigenous leaders are showing leadership. They're showing leadership in that the path of reconciliation is a difficult path, but it's a path that we have to walk with compassion and love and justice. And burning, let's be very clear, burning buildings in BC or anywhere is dangerous and it is wrong. We do not want to see any buildings being burned. There are steps we can take for justice, and we have to take those steps. But burning buildings is going to cause harm to communities. We don't know the risks for surrounding buildings, for people in those buildings and in those establishments. It is the wrong thing to do. But I understand the pain that people feel, the real pain and trauma people feel, because there's clearly a role the church played in the residential institutions. That pain is real, and we have to acknowledge that pain and walk the path of reconciliation with real steps. And that's why we said that the Liberal government right now is fighting kids in court. How can the Liberal government on one hand talk about the trauma of residential schools and the kids that were killed when they are fighting kids in court right now? That's an unbroken legacy. That same legacy of discrimination continues to this day, when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has found that the Canadian government didn't just discriminate Indigenous kids, did so willfully and recklessly. That's the words of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. So how can Justin Trudeau fight these kids in court knowing that ruling and denying the multiple court orders or multiple tribunal orders from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal? So that's one thing that has to happen. We've got to implement all the calls to action. Those calls to action were named very wisely calls to action, not recommendations to be shelved on a bookshelf, but real actions that need to be taken. And this Liberal government, Justin Trudeau, promised to implement all of them and has been in power for 6 years and has only done a mere fraction of the 94 calls to action. So that has to happen. And right now, I just met with an Indigenous community leader who's had to fundraise for money to help the community deal with the trauma that's resurfacing because of the discoveries of children in unmarked graves. No Indigenous community should have to fundraise for money to deal with the trauma. The federal government has a responsibility to provide the resources for the healing, for the supports that communities that are reeling with this trauma are dealing with. That's something that has to happen as well. Well, I'll start with the childcare question and whether the Liberals will do it or not. And what we've seen with specific with childcare is that it's been broken promise after broken promise. It's been decades. And I don't think Canadians are going to forget that the Liberals have been promising childcare since the 90s. It's been almost 3 decades of broken promises. So they're announcing another big commitment right before they're going to do an election. It sounds very much like the same thing. And we've got some real recent examples. The Liberal government and Justin Trudeau openly campaigned on Pharmacare in 2019, not too long ago. They campaigned on it. He repeated that commitment in the throne speech. And then when we tabled a bill that was modeled off after the report that the Liberal government commissioned themselves, we put forward that legislation to actually walk the path of getting Pharmacare to happen, and the Liberals voted against it. So they turned their back on Canadians, and the only people that benefit from that are large pharmaceutical companies. So we've seen this Liberal government make a lot of promises very recently in campaigns and then break those promises. And so I am very skeptical, but the one thing I know is when New Democrats are elected, we actually fight and get the help delivered. We saw a number of times when the Liberals wanted to do the minimum in this pandemic, and we pushed them and fought to deliver the help that people needed. So that's why I think we need New Democrats to be there to make this happen. And that's why, again, I think it is a wrong thing for the Liberals to call an election. What would stop them from calling an election? I think they should stop now, given that we are seeing a lot of concerns around potential variants. We've seen that vaccination, while incredibly important, doesn't mean that we can completely stop the spread. So we've got to be very vigilant and careful to prevent the spread and be very careful when we look at the numbers. So I think that should be enough to give pause, but we know that potential variants that we've seen in other countries could spike in Canada, and that could result in another potential lockdown or a potential 4th wave. So those are some of the things that might happen. But that's why we should be very careful now and not waste all the sacrifices made by plunging the country into an election. Our goal should be now get past this pandemic, get everyone vaccinated, get help to people, and have a recovery that focuses on what people need.
What's the public health situation that you think would be?
We'll just wait 1 sec here for that.
Where would the public health situation have to be for you think it would be safe to have Canadians head to the polls?
Well, we have 2 years left on our mandate, so there's really no reason that we need to call an election before 2 years. We can go the full 2 years of this term and have an election as initially scheduled. I think that would make sense, but we need to at least get to a point where we've got a massive or a significant number of vaccination, double dose. So what public health officials have been saying is that 75% is a number that they've been looking at. I would always defer to the advice of public health experts, but vaccination numbers that are very high, where we get everyone vaccinated, and we've given some space after that vaccination to see if the numbers stay low. Those would be some of the basic steps that I would think we need to achieve before we even consider an election.
Justin Trudeau is polling and he's encroaching on majority territory. What's your message going to be before we possibly go to the polls to change Canadian plans?
My message to Canadians when it comes to what we've seen in this pandemic is Justin Trudeau tried to do the minimum at every step. 10% wage subsidy. He tried to not bring in CERB, and then when he did, add $1,000, no help for students, and would not do a paid sick leave. We fought and brought each of those things forward. We made sure people had enough money to stay at home and to pay their bills and be able to make ends meet. We made sure students were included and got direct financial support. We made sure the wage subsidy was high enough so that people could stay in their jobs, saving millions of people their jobs. We made sure there was paid sick leave in place that Premier Horgan also fought for, and we were able to achieve at the federal level. New Democrats fought to bring all the help that Canadians needed to the level that it was at to give people the dignity and the respect they needed. Without New Democrats, people would not have got that help. So my message to Canadians, if you want someone that's on your side that's going to fight for you, New Democrats like Laurel Collins here in Victoria, like Randall Garrison and Gord Johns, who are here with me today, and New Democrats across this country will help you and your family and fight for you and your family.
Mr. Singh, one question.
Sorry,
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you much. Thank you.